Okay, let's jump right into this. There's a chilling quote from Adolf Hitler, reportedly said right before his demise. "My spirit will rise from the grave and the world will see I was right." It is, well, it's a haunting statement, right? And it really forces us to look closely at how history remembers its darkest figures. Today, we're going to deconstruct the source material of a fascinating documentary that actually looks beyond the man himself. We are exploring The Systems Monster, how code built the world's first digital villain, examining the vast global network that actually allowed him to rise. The documentary kicks things off with a massive question. Is it actually possible for a single individual to orchestrate a global war and a mass holocaust, just entirely on their own? You know, we're so used to thinking of history in terms of these lone evil masterminds. But today, we're diving into the data, the historical context, and the unseen technological and global systems that literally manufactured an unprecedented era of terror. To figure this out, we are going to follow a pretty structured investigation based on the source. We'll hit 6 main points. 1. The ultimate villain. 2. Birth of a dictator. 3. Comparing historical atrocities. 4. The roots of hatred. 5. A global shared evil. And finally, 6. Who writes the history?
Let's start with Section 1, the ultimate villain, and the mainstream narrative.
According to the source, when people hear this dictator's name, their minds immediately jump to 3 primary things. First, the absolutely unprecedented torture and mass killings. Second, the idea that he was the singular lone trigger for World War II. And third, the extreme anti-Semitism that resulted in the tragic Holocaust of 6 million Jews. Make no mistake, this is the foundational historical narrative we've all been taught since we were kids.
Moving to Section 2, the birth of a dictator.
To understand the monster, the documentary argues we really have to zoom out and look at his highly improbable rise to power. Check out this timeline. It's wild. Back in 1914, he was literally just a courier boy in World War I. Astonishingly, by 1918, he gets temporarily blinded by a gas attack, and while wandering around unarmed, he's actually spared by a British soldier named Henry Tandy. Then you fast forward through a failed coup and some time in prison, and somehow by 1933, this lowly, once spared soldier maneuvers his way into becoming the German chancellor. So the question is, how on earth does a society let that happen?
Well, the crucial piece of the puzzle here is the Treaty of Versailles. This 1919 peace agreement absolutely broke Germany's back. It imposed these crippling economic punishments that triggered insane hyperinflation. The source notes that citizens were literally carrying around suitcases completely stuffed with cash just to buy a single loaf of bread. Imagine that. It entirely broke the spirit of the people, making them desperate, angry, and frankly incredibly vulnerable to any radical savior who promised to restore their dignity.
But here's the thing. He didn't just seize power by force. It was basically handed to him by a manipulative political system. The source explains how political elites, specifically a guy named von Papen, tried to use Hitler as a puppet to get their own majorities. They made him chancellor, genuinely thinking they could control him. Big mistake. Within a month, the Reichstag parliament building catches fire. He instantly blames his political opponents, seizes emergency powers, and passes the Enabling Act, which effectively locked in his absolute dictatorial power. The system thought they were playing him, but he completely outplayed the system.
All right, let's look at Section 3, comparing historical atrocities.
The documentary brings up some very sensitive data here, and it presents a stark, uncomfortable reality. Just look at these numbers. You have Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward, which created a man-made famine starving 30 to 40 million people. Then Joseph Stalin overseeing the freezing gulags and the Holodomor famine, killing over 20 million. And Hideki Tojo overseeing Unit 731, where horrific live human experiments were conducted on millions. These death tolls massively, I mean massively, eclipse Hitler's. And yet, the source points out that these figures aren't always viewed with the same unmatched infamy in our mainstream dialogue.
So why is that? The documentary highlights a pretty fascinating difference in, well, essentially public relations. While leaders like Mao and Stalin rebranded their slaughter as agricultural development or cultural revolutions, Hitler openly admitted and campaigned on his genocidal plans. He didn't hide his hatred behind the guise of progress, and because of that, it made him the easiest, most undeniable target for absolute vilification by the rest of the world.
Which brings us to Section 4, the roots of hatred.
Now, what's really interesting about this next point is how it explores the origins of that anti-Semitism. The source reveals a genuinely surprising fact. Hitler deeply admired the American industrialist Henry Ford. In fact, Ford was the only American mentioned favorably in Hitler's manifesto. Why? Because Ford was actively publishing a weekly newspaper featuring fierce anti-Semitic propaganda, a whole series called The International Jew. Ford's massive global influence helped legitimize this hatred way before Hitler ever took total power.
And if we look at history, this prejudice definitely wasn't isolated to 1930s Germany. The source data here outlines how Jewish communities were systematically expelled from nations globally for thousands of years. We're talking England in 1290, France in 1394, Spain in 1492. These expulsions stemmed from incredibly deep-rooted religious and societal conflicts that span millennia.
And this illustrates a pretty terrifying truth. Hitler did not invent anti-Semitism. The explainer emphasizes that he merely weaponized a hatred that had already been ingrained in global societies for thousands of years. He just took those existing public sentiments and completely weaponized them into a political tool to unify a broken nation against a common scapegoat.
Okay, part 5. A global shared evil. This is really the crux of the whole thing.
The source highlights a really fascinating historical pattern when it comes to global finance. It shows that leaders who bypass international central bankers to create their own currency, like Lincoln, JFK, and Gaddafi, often meet violent systemic resistance. Well, in 1933, Hitler did exactly this. He bypassed the global banks entirely, created a parallel currency called Mifo bills, and dropped Germany's unemployment from 30% down to 2% in just 5 years. By challenging the international financial system that aggressively, the documentary argues he set the stage for an absolute inevitable global collision.
But, and this is crucial, he didn't build this war machine alone. This is where we see how code essentially built the world's first digital villain. The documentary points out that American tech giant IBM literally provided the early punch card technology that allowed the Nazi regime to identify, track, and process populations with horrific data-driven efficiency. Think about that. Long before modern computing, this was raw code and data processing being weaponized for genocide. Meanwhile, automotive giants like BMW, Volkswagen, and Porsche were profiting heavily. And geopolitically, England signed the Munich Agreement, turning a blind eye, while the Soviet Union flat out agreed to carve out Poland. The evil wasn't just some local industrial boom, it was deeply technological and deeply shared across the globe.
Finally, Section 6. Who writes the history? So we have to ask, why does the mainstream narrative focus almost entirely on one man and ignore the complicit system? According to the analysis in the source material, the Allied powers, who, let's remember, also caused massive civilian casualties themselves through bombings and blockades, they desperately needed a singular, absolute monster. By centralizing all the evil of the 20th century onto one man, they were able to justify their own extreme actions and frame themselves purely as the undisputed heroes of the era.
This quote right here really encapsulates the entire investigation. History is written by the victors, and the victor always needs a villain. The documentary is very clear on this point. This analysis absolutely does not absolve the dictator of his horrific crimes. His actions were undoubtedly purely evil. But what it does do is expose how the winning system hides its own complicity, its own massive profits, and its own technological enablement behind his dark shadow.
So I'm going to leave you with this provocative thought from the source material. If the ultimate historical villain was heavily manufactured, funded, and technologically enabled by a vast global system, a system that used early code and data to streamline atrocities before washing its hands of the creation, how should we look at the narratives we're being fed today? When we see conflicts on the news right now, are we just looking at the designated villain, or do we need to start examining the system that built them? Thank you for exploring the source material with me today.